Hi everyone, it's Patrick Nierzwicki. It's October 3rd, and this is going to be my presentation on the main sequence of events involved in a neuron firing. Okay, so I think first thing first, before we get started, just some main concepts that kind of underline the main sequence of events for a neuron firing is really at the various stages. We're talking about like electric potential, right? So that's going to be the difference between the concentration of charged particles inside of the cell and outside of the cell membrane. And that's really what we're talking about at the various stages of the electron firing. And then in terms of things moving in and out of the cell membrane, right, that would be the current, the flow of charged particles from one point to another. So again, I think that's just kind of a fundamental thing to understand before we jump into the various stages of a neuron firing. So the first stage is going to be resting potential, and that's really the phase I like to think of is like the main baseline, or like the charged battery. That's the starting point from which all of this will always begin. One thing to keep in mind is, in terms of how that's measured from an electrical particle standpoint, that's going to be negative 70 millivolts, and then we would refer to this as a polarized state because you have a difference, a significant difference between the number of charged particles inside and outside of the cell. So in terms of how we get to the negative 70 millivolts, it's important to understand, like as we covered in class, that there's a sodium-potassium pump, and that's an active method of transportation where ions are moving in and outside of the neuron cell. And what you'll see is you have more sodium ions moving out than you have potassium ions coming in via the sodium-potassium pump. And what that leads to is there being more positive ions in the extracellular fluid comparatively to the number of positive ions in the intercellular fluid. And you'll see here represented with a 9 and a 7. The next stage is going to be based on the local potential. And I think the thing to keep in mind here, the way that I'm thinking about this is going to be the input or the nudge that moves us away from the resting potential. And really the fundamental consideration with the local potential is whether or not you're going to reach the negative 55 millivolts. If you do, you'll get to the active potential, which we'll get to here in a moment. But if you don't, right, you'll just return back to the baseline. So in terms of what that looks like with the ions inside and outside of the cell, right, you always have the sodium-potassium pump doing its thing, which is always going to lead to more sodium going out than potassium coming in. However, when there's a stimulus and the local potential begins, there's two gates within the cellular membrane as well that will, things will begin to happen in addition to that sodium-potassium pump, which is always going. And in this case, the sodium gate opens up, leading, and by the way, these gates are diffusion, so no ATP is being used compared to the sodium-potassium pump, which is active, so ATP is being used. But in this case, you have sodium moving into the cell, and what you'll see happening here then is, remember in our resting potential state, we had kind of a baseline of 9 on the outside and 7 on the outside. And these numbers aren't going to be exact, but just to kind of illustrate the point, in this case, we now have 9 on the outside and 8 in the inside. So you'll see that the difference between the positive ion concentration is getting smaller at the local potential. And again, really the fundamental question or point here is, are we going to reach that negative 55 millivolts? If we don't, that means that the stimulus wasn't strong enough and an action potential is not going to be triggered. If you do, right, then we'll trigger the next chain of events, which is going to be the actual action potential, right? And this is going to be the main neuron firing event. And I should say in the previous stage, we do have some level of depolarization going on, right? The difference is getting smaller. But in the action potential, this is where we're going to have rapid depolarization. And really, the reason why is at this point, the sodium gates are wide open, and sodium is really flooding into the cell, where not only do we eventually reach 0 millivolts, we'll actually get to a positive point of 35 millivolts, which is when the neuron will fire. Once you do get to that 35 millivolts, what eventually ends up happening is this sodium gate will close, this potassium gate will open, and repolarization will occur. So you'll eventually get back to this state that we originally started at, where there was a higher concentration of positive ions on the outside of the cell versus the inside of the cell, and get back to that negative 70 millivolts. And in terms of what that looks like, kind of end to end from a millivolt standpoint, right? So you'll see the resting potential here, local potential, is introduced here. And again, the real consideration is, are you going to get to that negative 55 millivolt threshold? If yes, rapid depolarization will occur and you'll get the action potential. If it doesn't, right, it would just go back down, because the action potential is all or nothing event. And then eventually, once you get to that, during the action potential, once you get to the 35 millivolts, it will go back down to its resting state via repolarization. All right, that's my video. Please provide any feedback that you might have, and I look forward to watching all of your guys' videos, and we'll see you all in class this Monday. Thanks.